for coming. Welcome to our last event in this semester's Asian Exploration Series, where we're going to turn our focus to South Asia. This series that's been going on throughout the semester has been part of a project running alongside our History 112 World Civilization 2 classes, led by Dr. Sandy Peterson. It's sponsored also by the Global Distinction Program here at Durham Tech and the Humanities and Fine Arts discipline in the Art Sciences and University Transfer Department. We couldn't have done it at all without the support of the Carolina Asia Center, so we definitely thank them for their support in this project. Today, we have with us Dr. David Gilmartin from NC State University. He's a professor of history there and with the expertise in South Asia. His research focuses on the history of British imperialism in South Asia and the development of modern politics and forms of rule from that. So we welcome Dr. Gilmartin to talk to us about British India's partition. Thank you very
much. Thanks, Shannon. And thank you all for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to come. And before I start, I've gotten some sense from Dr. Peterson about what you've covered about decolonization and a bit about India and Gandhi and so on. But I don't know completely what you've talked about, so if there are any issues that I raise that you have questions about, please feel free to interrupt. I don't mind at all being interrupted. Just, wave your hands and ask your questions. So the topic today is on British India's territorial partition. And actually, I have up here a piece of artwork by a contemporary Pakistani artist, and it's intended to capture this vision of a kind of, almost chain that has split India and Pakistan apart, since these were at one time part of the same territory that was British India. So the backdrop to this story today that I want to talk about is not only the story of the actual process by which partition came about, and India, which was the greatest of all the colonial possessions. I mean, it was, in terms of population, by far the largest, central to the whole British Empire. But when the British left, it was divided. So I want to talk about not only how that happened, but how the legacies of that have continued to shape the politics of this part of the world right up to the present day. So what we want to start with is British India itself, and this is a map that shows the size of this territory. There are certain things there that you can see on the far right. Burma was part of the British Indian Empire, though it was separated a little bit before partition, so it was not part of this process. But in any case, this was a huge territory which at the time of partition had somewhere over 300 million people. But what's interesting about it is not only the fact that this huge territory was divided in 1947 at the very moment when the British left, but also the nature of this division. So what happened was that when the British left, what had been British India was divided into two countries. And those countries were, on the one hand, what we call India today, though India previously had been a much larger territory, and the new state of Pakistan. But what is so strange about this, as you can see from this map, Pakistan was created as a new country with two completely separate parts, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, which were separated by roughly 1,000 miles of Indian territory between them. So, I mean, this really is quite unprecedented in world history. There are cases of some countries that have separated territories, such as the US with Alaska, but these are not common. And this is the most spectacular example of this in world history, because these two parts had roughly the same population, slightly more in East Pakistan, even though it's smaller, it had a slightly larger population. But the country completely split. So the question is, how did this come about? And the simple answer is that when the British decided to leave, they, at that moment, split the subcontinent on the basis of religious population. So that where Muslims were a majority of the population, those were the areas that became Pakistan, and where Muslims were not a majority of the population, those were the areas that continued to be India. So I mean, that's on one level pretty simple and easy to grasp, except that the foundations for how this division is made, why should this religious division have been made, are much more complicated and filled with contradictions, and which is why this has had such a continuing, and I might add, in many ways, very largely negative impact on this, and not just on this region, but on the world itself, because the history of the so-called spread of terrorism and Islamic terrorism in the world, I mean, this is a subject which is absolutely impossible to understand without this story. So where did the idea for Pakistan come from? So again, the simple answer to this is that it came from the so-called two-nation theory of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So who was Muhammad Ali Jinnah? He was the leader of a Muslim political party in India, which was known as the Muslim League, which was founded at the beginning of the 20th century, but really only gained significant popularity in the 1930s. So Jinnah was the leader of this organization, which is the organization that put forward the demand for Pakistan. And so Jinnah today in Pakistan is viewed as the father of the country. So if you go to Pakistan, you'll see his pictures everywhere. But what's interesting was his argument here. He claimed there should be two countries because he said there were two nations in British India. And what he meant by that was that Hindus and Muslims were not simply two different religions. They didn't just belong to two religions, but that those represented two different nations. And the implication is, of course, a nation needs to have its own separate state. But what does that mean? So I'm not going to read this whole quote up here, but you can read some of the things that Jinnah used to justify this idea of a nation. It has to do with a different culture, different customs, literatures, visions of history, different heroes, all this kind of stuff. But just, take note, this is a very ambiguous and hard to pin down definition. Yeah, question in the back. Yeah, so very interesting point. So, one critical thing lying behind this is that he's claiming there are these various cultural dividers, but there's certain things he's not mentioning because they cut across this Hindu-Muslim division. And one absolutely central one is language. So Muslims in India do not speak a language which is distinct from the languages that Hindus speak. Now, Jinnah made certain claims. And here, this is a complex story. There are two languages in India that are called Urdu and that are called Hindi, and they're written in different scripts. And the script that Hindi is written in derives ultimately from a script used for Sanskrit, which goes back some thousands of years, while Urdu is written in the Arabic script with some modifications. And so those languages were often imagined and projected as being associated with religion. But two things about them. One is, in common, everyday spoken language, they're the same language. They're really not different. They have some different vocabulary, and the states that exist today have tried to make them different. But in origin, they have the same grammar, they're the same language. But beyond that, the languages, even taken together, don't make up 50% of the population in India. So there are huge numbers of people who speak other languages. And just to quickly go back, this East Pakistan area is in a region known as Bengal, in which people speak Bengali, which is an entirely separate language. So yes, language does not sort of map onto this division, but interestingly enough, there are lots of other things that don't map onto it too. So, I mean, when Jinnah said there's separate literatures, that's simply not true. There are certain literatures, there's certain things which one can say, oh yes, certain types of particularly religious literature, that yes, this is Hindu and this is Muslim. But there's a vast realm of literature which is widely read and spoken, including oral literature, which crosses this divide. And also there are many, I'll come back to this, many regional distinctions in India which also do not map onto any division. So that's the interesting point, but there's another critical ambiguity here which I want to just emphasize by going back to this map. And you remember I said a second ago that the basis for this division was where Muslims were in a majority. So you can see from this map the dark green are the highest percentages, and you can see those concentrated where East Pakistan was and where West Pakistan was. But these other shades suggest significant Muslim populations. So if Muslims really are a separate nation, if religions are separate nations, then theoretically all those Muslims everywhere should be part of a separate Muslim nation. So simply pulling out the Muslim majority areas in no way maps on to this two-nation theory. And as we'll see, that was later to become a huge issue. So anyway, this was the backdrop. And just quickly to go through this, what happened was when the British left India, they, in part in response to pressures that they were facing, but in part reflecting their own underlying sort of notions about the nature of India, which again I'll come back to, they developed this plan to partition India. So this is a photograph of the critical meeting in June 1947 when the decision to partition India was made. So just to show you, this is the Viceroy, the British ruler, Lord Mountbatten. This is Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and these are some other Muslim League leaders. this is Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the leader of the Indian National Congress with some others. And though no one was happy about this, they made the decision to split India. So then what happened was this lawyer, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, was brought out from England. He, in fact, had never been to India before in his entire life, and he was commissioned with drawing the boundaries that would separate India and Pakistan. So he spent a summer, basically from June until August 1947, and drew these lines, these red lines on there to separate the country. And then a couple days after the formal declaration of independence, he flew back to England and never came to South Asia ever again. But having left what was a huge legacy. So we'll come back in just a bit to why all this happened, but just to carry it forward, what immediately followed this, and the answer is massive violence. So, I mean, to understand that, the worst violence was in one province in northern India called the Punjab, which was itself split. So not only all of India, but this particular province was also split. This is the Radcliffe line running right through the center. And it also had a Muslim majority in the west and a Muslim minority only in the east. So it followed the basic principle. But here you can see also very clearly, even though there's a majority, there were these huge minorities on both sides of the line. So what happened when partition was declared? Many people were caught on the wrong side of the line. And people said, oh, everything will be fine. But in fact, if a country has been created on the basis of Muslims and Hindus being separate nations, clearly no one is going to feel very safe if they aren't part of the nation that's supposed to define the country. So what happened was a huge migration was set off of people traveling in opposite directions. So I have a few photographs here. These are from Margaret Bourke White, an American photographer who took a whole series of photos. If any of you have any opportunity to see these, they've been published. Beyond these, they're really fascinating pictures. But what she's photographing here is one of these long caravans of refugees that set off traveling to the other side in the wake of partition. And as you can see here, huge numbers of these people are, were very poor farmers who set off with these bullock carts carrying basically all their possessions. Yeah.
So will you touch on how the forced migration, people are leaving their ancestral lands, their businesses, their homes. Did the Brits buy up a lot of that stuff?
No. In fact, that is an excellent question, because that then became a huge controversial issue, and one actually connected to the violence, because what happened was there was a huge amount after all of this of what they call evacuee property. And so on both sides of the border, the state, in theory, took control of this and redistributed it to refugees who were coming in. But in actual fact, there was a huge amount of conflict, and in many cases, refugees coming in the midst of a lot of violence, deliberately drove people out through threats of violence and attacks so that they could claim evacuee property. But the distribution of this property went on for years and years and years after this. So it was a critical issue. And the other thing is, of course, this is a caravan of people heading in one direction. Exactly similar caravans were going in the opposite direction. And so you can imagine what happened when these crossed. This is one context in which violence took place. But I don't want to suggest this was the only way migration occurred. This is another picture of Margaret Bourke White's of the docks at Bombay at the time of partition. And huge numbers of Muslims desperately trying to get on ships to leave and go to Karachi, and probably most famously, because it's been most written about, trains carrying people in both directions. British India had a huge railway network, so travel by train was very common. And these trains became, carriers of refugees, so people just jammed on the tops of these trains, packed into these trains, and one of the great horror stories of partition was that in a number of cases, these refugee trains were attacked and most of the people on them killed, and then they went across the line and arrived in, some going to India, some going to Pakistan, with really nothing but massive numbers of bodies of people who had been killed. So this, there are some accounts of, people who saw this, including soldiers who had to deal with these trains, and, it was like the Holocaust, this sense of just a cataclysm that had happened. And also, interestingly, these trains figure largely in the imagination, even today, in literature about everything that happened. And just one last picture. This is a picture of a refugee camp in Delhi. So refugee camps were set up all over the place, and partly it was to collect people so that they could be evacuated in safer ways. But what happened was, even many people who didn't necessarily want to leave were driven out. And again, this is where the new refugees coming in often were themselves the perpetrators of violence in order to lay claim to property and houses and all of this. So just a quick summary, and I know statistics don't capture the meanings of this sort of thing, and these statistics are very contested even now. But generally speaking, 13 to 15 million refugees crossed the line at partition. And again, the estimates range between 200,000 and about 1 million, but more recent scholarship has suggested the higher figures are probably closer to the mark. So there are some scholars who even suggest the 1 million figure is a little low, though most people put it in the 500,000 to 1 million category. So just a last picture to kind of sum up the vision of this. So this is the cover of Time magazine. So this was published in the United States, and it suggests a kind of image of what happened. This was published in the fall of 1947, so a month or two after this had happened. And it shows this is the Hindu goddess Kali, the goddess who's is often associated with strength and violence as a protective goddess. But here what's going on in this quite remarkable picture is that, the goddess is clutching the map of India and basically stabbing herself. And you can see it's a partition map with Pakistan there, and I don't know if you can see the caption is India, liberty, and death. Yes, in the back. For the heart, yeah. Well, that's very interesting because this is almost exactly the site of Delhi, which was the capital, just right there in North India. And of course, the liberty and death reference for an American audience is what?
Liberty and death, Patrick.
Sorry?
Patrick Henry?
Yeah, Patrick Henry, you know, give me liberty or give me death. And here, it's liberty and death. That's all captured in this. So I now want to go on to this question of how did this happen? Why did it happen? And any other quick questions? Yeah.
I'm sorry I came in late.
Yeah, that's all right.
Did you address the planning in the 20s and 30s about partitioning into many regions?
Yeah, so I'm going to come to that with some maps about how this ultimate partition, in fact, it's not like this was set in stone. People had all kinds of different possible visions of what would happen when the British left, which is quite interesting to see.
Radcliffe involved in those early?
No, Radcliffe, as I said, flew out from India to draw the line. From Britain to India to draw the line, and then just went immediately back. He had no experience in India. That was partly the idea. They wanted to get somebody who could be projected as impartial, but it also meant he had no real experience in India when he drew these lines. Yeah, another question up here. When Radcliffe came, 1947. Radcliffe came, in June 1947 and left in August 1947. That was it. So the question, how and why did this happen is a huge question. And just to say, before I get into this just a bit, this is not a question for which there are clear and consensus-based answers. Even today, if you ask why did partition happen, you will get a whole range of answers with people putting responsibility in different places, some putting the reasons for this very close to the events, saying that, the reasons for partition need only to be tracked back to a few years before it, others pushing it back decades, and others pushing it back centuries. So it's a complex issue. But probably the clearest frame for thinking about this for historians was provided by India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who during World War II, this was before partition, Nehru wrote a book called The Discovery of India. And a big part of this book was to explain why, under British rule, religious hostility had increased in India, and why the boundaries between religions had hardened under the British. So this was Nehru's argument, and so out of this, of course, has come a historical argument that though there are many participants and many issues, that ultimately the British and the way they ruled are really to blame. Yeah?
Just clarification, what year was the original invasion by the Brits to India?
So the British first came, the British East India Company first came to India in the 17th century. So that's going way back. The beginning of territorial control over India goes back to the second half of the 18th century. So that's, the beginnings of this would be about 200 years before 1947. But it's all complicated because the original British conquest of India, in fact, was not a conquest by the British government. It was by the British East India Company, actually the English East India Company. So the takeover of India by the British government itself, by the British Crown, occurred in 1858. So that's about 90 years before partition. So that's usually thought of as the period of high British imperialism. But in fact, British presence in India goes back well before that. And under the company, they had made a lot of important interventions into India's history. So this, what Nehru talks about here, goes back even into the company period, though it's most clear in the high period of British imperialism. But what he says is the British basically followed a policy of divide and rule. And you know, as a foreign conqueror, what better way to rule than to play off pre-existing divisions among the people? So here, the British did not create the distinction between Hindus and Muslims, which was very old, nor did they create conflict. But in fact, what he argues is, though there was some conflict, this was balanced by all kinds of different ways in which Hindus and Muslims shared culture and participated together in various types of political enterprises. So it's very common that Hindus, for example, served in the government of the Mughal Empire, which was Muslim, before the British came. So there were all kinds of connections, but Nehru's argument actually is more interesting than simply overt divide and rule, because, and this is where historians have picked up on this, because he does say they consciously practice divide and rule, but he goes beyond that and says that some of the deepest divisions they created were not tied to a conscious divide and rule policy, but rather to the what he, you know, and others have talked about as the forms of knowledge that the British ruled in controlling India. So the British were foreigners, so they wanted to know India and what it was. So how do you do that? How do you gain knowledge of a place you don't know much about? And the way they did that was they tried to understand all the divisions within Indian society. So they developed a huge literature on all of the different practices of Hindus and Muslims, and this was all laid out in all kinds of British works, but it wasn't just Hindus and Muslims. They did studies of Indian languages. They did vast studies of castes in India, of these, you know, ascriptive divisions within Indian society. And all this had the effect of hardening the definitional boundaries between these different groups. And this found its clearest expression in the census. So the British began taking censuses of India beginning in the 1870s. So censuses are, you know, we're all familiar with this. They're intended to count the population. But they don't just count the population, they also count who belongs to what groups. And the British vision was that India was composed of all these different groups. So they counted carefully. So the census came out for the first time with these figures. So many Hindus, so many Muslims, so many people who belong to other religions, all counted and laid out for every province, every district in India. So when you do it that way, so you say, for example, in Punjab, there are, say, according to the 1931 census, there are 18 million something Muslims and 16 million something Hindus. I mean, I don't know what the exact figures are. But so what does that mean? So that creates this image. This is a fundamental division. The fact that many of those Muslims and many of those Hindus follow all kinds of totally different practices, may think of themselves in terms of other sectarian identities or castes or other things, but that then becomes the main division, and the census projects this image that everyone in this category on some level is exactly the same. You know, 18 million Muslims, well, they must have something in common. So then stereotypes get projected onto them. Well, Muslims do this, they do this is what defines a Muslim. When in fact in everyday life before that, these types of definitions were really hard to nail down. So it hardens all of these boundaries. But the thing is, this is not just imposed by the British, and this is where Nehru was very perceptive on this, because what he argued was these British categories influenced major reform movements within Indian religions, in Hinduism, in Islam. So that, you know, if Hindus are all one group, then these reformers appear, and they found these organizations like Brahmo Samaj or Arya Samaj, whose aim is to go back to the original text. You know, if Hindus are all one group, then we should all have a common scripture. We should all follow the same things. So they go back to what they see are the original scriptures of Hinduism, and they try to reform everybody. You know, if you're practicing some practice which is not in the Vedas, then you need to be reformed. You need to give that up so that we can all, in a religion, as these people would see it, all be one. And you can imagine one of the things they emphasize, this is very clear, is one thing that Hindus are not, is Muslims. So they go out of their way to try to condemn any practices which suggest that Hindus and Muslims had common religious customs, so that they can really separate these groups. And these are not British controlled in any way. It may be this British model that's influencing them, but it's not the British who are organizing these. These are Indians themselves who are doing this. And very much the same among Muslims. So this is just one example. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan founded this university at a place in North India called Aligarh, and this became a Muslim university. And again, Aligarh Muslim University, part of the point was to create a common Muslim culture and identity. And this is only one of many such things. So this didn't influence everybody, and I want to mention Gandhi and his role. So Gandhi very much emphasized commonalities of faith that transcended these, you know, what he saw as worldly religious definitions. So in his view, there was a kind of higher truth that transcended whether one was a Muslim or whether one was a Hindu or any religion. So he wrote about this explicitly, and his vision of non-cooperation with the British was tied to a notion, satya, truth, which transcended, at least as he saw it, any specific religion. And there were many like Gandhi. So it's not to say that everyone fell into these things, but these were powerful enough that even commitment to truth, even commitment to nationalism came to be widely seen in religious terms, because this was sort of the ultimate identity that had developed under the British. So a good example of this is the mobilization during the nationalist movement, and here Gandhi was leading this, of this figure Bharat Mata, which literally means Mother India. So this is projected as a figure that encompasses everyone. So this is India. This is all of India, and you see Mother India here standing on a map of all of India, and this Bande Mataram is a slogan which means hail to the mother. And this idea is India is an encompassing mother that can include all these different groups. And yet, what do you see in this picture? You see a Hindu goddess, and who's carrying this flag with Om, which is this thing the Arya Samaj used. Is an idea sort of, it's this sacred syllable going back to the Vedas. And so what happened was, even in Gandhi's movement, this kind of religious imagery became extremely common. So this is one critical element in the way that these religious identities came to be part of national identity. But I don't want to suggest even, I mean, when I said Gandhi himself didn't buy into this, this is very important. I mean, Gandhi did use this imagery, but if he, you know, there's this famous moment when having to do with riots between Hindus and Muslims, and Gandhi said, well, I'm a Hindu, and then he says, and I'm a Muslim, and I'm a Christian, you know, and the point was, true religious people do not belong to one narrow religion, and again, Gandhi was not alone in this. So there was this, there was a foundation for imagining an identity that transcended these religions. But back to our friends, the British, one of the things that really pushed things in the direction of these religious identities, and this is not quite so straightforward, but the fact is, this is a map of India, the Indian Empire under the British. So you remember I showed you that big red map before, which was just a red map. This is the British Empire in India. This is a map showing all the internal boundaries and divisions in India under British rule. And what it shows you is that there are many, that India was not a unified country. It was divided into provinces, into states, most of which had their own distinctive languages. Very often there were very important and powerful regional cultures that set people apart. Huge differences between North India and South India, for example, where completely unrelated languages were spoken. And so the British structure of rule, if it used divide and rule, didn't just do it on the basis of religion. It did it on the basis of all these other things, which very often cut right across religion. But the thing is, if you are influenced by a kind of reformed vision of religion as a unifier, how are you going to see all of these divisions within your religious community? You see them as threats to unity. You see them as divisions that undermine what ought to be a unified religious community. So this, I mean, this just suggests that this was all heightened by the fact that the British themselves, after 1919, and here, this detail you don't need to worry about, but the British went about creating this structure where every province had its own separate legislature, and this was all to respond to those people who pushed a kind of unified Indian identity. Well, the British responded by giving more power to people to buy them off, but not at the central level, at the level of all of these different provinces. And this runs right through, even as elections are introduced. The elections at the national level don't matter. The elections that matter are all at the provincial level, because the British are trying to make this important. And so people are getting more power. But all of this is at the provincial level. So not surprisingly, the regional parties develop. So these two big Muslim provinces, in fact, have parties that stress, yes, being Muslim is part of it, but also the distinctiveness of a Punjabi identity and of a Bengali identity. That's what matters to people. So what does Muhammad Ali Jinnah think about this? So this is, you know, here's Jinnah and Gandhi, you know, sharing a good joke. But the thing is, for Jinnah, the problem in creating a vision of a unified Muslim community is not just about opposition to Gandhi and Hindus. it's also about all these divisions among Muslims. And there are many Muslims who feel this, that, why are we divided? And so what do you do if you're divided? And this is a critical backdrop to this idea about Pakistan. So in 1940, this is the first time the Muslim League comes out with this idea of a Muslim nation. This is, Jinnah gives his two-nation theory at this meeting, but then they go on to make an argument that there should be separate Muslim state, or states, as it was in this case. The idea being that only if they had a unified government could Muslims actually not continually be divided by all of these identities. So again, this dynamic is critical. This emphasis on religious division is not just people, well, I'm a Muslim and I'm a Hindu, so let's fight. It's rather, I'm a Muslim, but my community is divided. This is the worst thing. Or I'm a Hindu and we're divided. So how do we come together? And that means the threat is this division within as much as it is without. But that's why this becomes so focused and important. So what happens then in the 1930s, but particularly in the 1940s, is, given this backdrop, all kinds of different proposals start coming out. How do we deal with this? So this is from a guy named Chaudhry Rahmat Ali in the mid-1930s. He's the one who came up with the name Pakistan, which hadn't existed before. Pakistan here it means literally land of the pure, but Pak, pure. But it also, and he said this explicitly, the origin of it was a name which would bring all these different provinces together in a single unit. So P stands for Punjab, A stands for Afghania, the northwest frontier near Afghanistan. I stands for Industan, which is another name for Sindh in the lower part of Pakistan. And then Stan means place, country. So that was the idea. This was all dreamed up, But interestingly enough, if it's a word with all the letters of all these units that are supposed to be in it, what given what happened ultimately, what letter is missing? What was the area that became East Pakistan? Bengal. And there's no B there. So this suggests how there was so much uncertainty. So this is this map of Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, and so, Dinia. Dinia is a word, Deen means faith or religion. And so Dinia was this, new, as he says, continent of Dinia, which was going to have all these little, Muslim states. This was his plan. Yeah.
Is it the same word as
Yes, Deen is faith or religion. So Deen Ilahi is divine faith, and Dinia, this Dinia is a made-up word, which is like turning it into a, sort of a country like Albania, Dinia. So, but it's exactly the same word. That's right, Deen. So that was one example, but here's another. The Pak millet. So again, Pak means pure. Millet just means community, and this is the pure community. And this came out in 1940. But again, look at it. It's there's Pakistan up there, but there's a separate country called Bangistan. And then there's this thing called Osmanistan, which was there because there was a princely state called Hyderabad, which had a Muslim ruler. So it's really complicated. And then There's also this interesting little tongue, which of course corresponds to nothing that exists today. And that was just to have a little tongue out into, this goes back to that question earlier about the heart. That would include Delhi, the old capital, and that would include Agra, where the Taj Mahal is located. So, that could be part of the community as well. But there were many other plans. So this was a Muslim leader named Shahnawaz Khan Mamdouh who created this idea of a confederacy of India, of all of these different things. And then this is an idea that came out in 1946. So remember how close this is to 1947. This is like a year before partition occurred. And this is a proposal in a pamphlet, so this is Urdu, and it says Pakistan kya hai aur kaise banega, which means what is Pakistan and how will it be created? And so it's this question, I mean, the very fact that this is still being asked in 1946 shows how much uncertainty there was about this final arrangement. But as you can see here, maybe you can't, this says Pakistan Caliphate, and so it's this vision of a kind of religious state which extends all the way across North India so that these two parts can be united. And a new Medina, this is Medina, which is where the Prophet's community was originally established. And so within this pamphlet, there is this idea that, well, yes, Pakistan can't encompass everything, but it will be like a new Medina to the world, a new vision of Islamic power. Yeah.
To put it in perspective, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Europe and Asia? Like the same time this is.
Well, so this is right at the end of World War II. So this is when there's a big movement for decolonization going on. But what we have here in India is also considerable uncertainty about the form it should take. So I don't know if you've talked about this, but in as far as India's decolonization with the British went, from the time that the Labour Party came into power in England, which was in 1945, so as some of you may know, Winston Churchill, the great war leader in Great Britain, was voted out of office in a landslide the second World War II was over. And the Labour Party took control. And Clement Attlee was the prime minister, and the Labour Party essentially committed itself to Indian independence. This is 1945. So by that point, there's no doubt India is going to be independent. The question is simply the form that it will take. And so this is the context of all of this. And it's in this context that in 1946, the British sent out to India. They'd committed to leave. The question was, who is power going to be turned over to? What's the form? So they sent out to India what was called a cabinet mission. 3 members of the British cabinet went out, very high-level committee, to come up with a plan. And they developed in the spring of 1946 this plan called the Cabinet Mission Plan. And what this was a plan to both provide something that looked like Pakistan, but at the same time to keep India together. And the way they did this was by proposing a 3-tiered government, so that there would be provincial governments at the bottom, and then there would be a central government at the top, and then between those levels, there would be 3 separate, what they called groups of provinces. And those groups, which are shown on this map, the kind of yellow is princely states, which makes it a little less easy to see here. But the blue is one group, this kind of green over there is another group, and the purple is the third group. So the idea was two of these groups would have slight Muslim majorities, and the third group would have an overwhelmingly Hindu majority. So this was to try to balance power. So at the center, Hindus were in a great majority, something like 75% of India's population was Hindu, about 25% Muslim. Actually, there are other groups, Christians, Sikhs, so I'm not giving wholly accurate figures, but that gives you a rough idea. And the idea was that so the Hindu population would control at the center, but in these groups, 2 out of 3 would be controlled by Muslims. And then provinces would have their own powers. Yeah?
You had mentioned that in the past they were, before British rule, India wasn't so centered around dividing Muslim from Hindu or understanding who was what.
Yes.
So if they had known that's how they used to be, why didn't they consider like separation of church and state if already the religion issue is becoming a problem?
Well, yeah, I mean, the answer to that has to do with, if I understand your question right, with what I was just describing, like Nehru's argument that under the British, what had previously been very fluid boundaries had become more fixed, and a lot of Indian groups had bought into this notion, although not all, but many, and so that was the problem, you know, about dividing. But the basic problem goes back to the beginning. If you just divided, accepting, say, the two-nation theory, that Muslims and Hindus really were separate nations, then what problem did you have? That they're mixed together in much of the country. So how can you give that territorial expression, right? So, I mean, was that what you're getting at?
Why didn't they consider just establishing a government that didn't care what your religion was, no matter where you lived in India?
You mean, why didn't the British just say, you're having a unified government, we're leaving, you deal with it?
Don't worry about who's in power, just keep like the United States, we successfully have more multiple religions here because of our constitutional separation of church and state. You know, but over here, it sounds like India is just too concentrated on religion.
Yeah, well, that's indeed. But the point is, this isn't intrinsic to India in any way. This has to do, or this is what most people would argue, it has to do with the way the British ruled. And the way the British ruled in North America was part of a different era in the 18th century, which is quite different from what was going on in the late 19th century. But this is part, I mean, your point is really interesting, because this cabinet mission plan was in part a way to do that. It was a way to create a central government, but still keep all these people who were claiming they wanted a separate religious state, still give them something so that they would buy into this. That was the whole idea. So was there another question? Yeah.
Is it kind of like, not by design, but the effect of British rule kind of erased people that lived like on the line in the middle?
Yeah.
It kind of just make you choose a side versus being meshed in the middle?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Absolutely. That's what the argument would be, that people had different religions, but there was no notion that that should be your primary political identity and had to separate you from others. That you could have differences in this way, but similarities in that way. So you could come together in the middle. Yeah, exactly. So yes.
Well, just so that because the Brits had basically imposed this external, this is really important, you have to choose whether you're Muslim or choose whether you're Indian, choose what kind of, because of that stuff, there's a legacy of continued division, and that's what kind of rolled into this.
Yes, yes, and that, and this is where I was trying, why I brought up these religious reform movements. I mean, you can talk about this as a product of British rule, but the point is that this had really affected the way lots of people approached religion, so that they were looking for more clearly defined unifying identities within religion. And so this, and again, just to stress this, not everybody, but this was a powerful enough force that it had to be dealt with. And this cabinet mission plan was precisely an effort to try to balance all of this and to make everybody happy. But it had certain drawbacks, and the main drawback it had for lots of people was it created a very weak central state. That was the only way you could pull this off and divide power. And so a lot of people, including Nehru himself, didn't like that aspect. Yeah.
Well, that was the British planning policy, was to create a weak, dependent former colony to
Yeah.
maintain.
Economic control.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. In fact, there are two arguments about this in the literature. So one is that, yes, the cabinet mission would have very much played into the British leaving behind a weak government, which would have allowed British influence to continue in very significant ways. But there are people who argue that, in fact, what ultimately proved much more useful for the British to try to continue exerting influence was the actual division into India and Pakistan. Because this is what provided the opening, ultimately not so much for the British, but for the United States to enter into the region as a major player, primarily by providing military support to Pakistan in its early years, when Pakistan felt deeply threatened by India. So it maintained a kind of division which opened up things to Cold War influence, largely through Pakistan, because Pakistan is the one who felt most threatened in the wake of all this. So you can make two arguments on this. You could, I think your point is, one could see this as also shaped by British ideas about keeping India weak might be useful, but the ultimate decision, some would argue, ultimately proved more useful for Cold War penetration into the region. But in any case, what happened was this plan failed. That by the end of the summer of 1946, even though in the short run many accepted it, but ultimately it fell apart, and most famously when Nehru himself, who had initially accepted it, then sort of gave a press conference where he said, we don't consider this binding on us. If we want to strengthen the central state, we will. And that was the end of it. And so then what happened was, starting with the Calcutta riots in 1946, violence started breaking out on a large scale. So there were local riots in a number of places. These spread across North India. By the beginning of 1947, this violence had become quite severe. The British found themselves unable to effectively deal with it. In fact, they had been developing these secret plans about, evacuating from India without any solution if they had to. So there was, many saw India as moving toward a civil war at this point. So it was in that context that the British sent out the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, who was a relative of the king, of the royal family, so he had huge independent influence. And his brief was to develop a plan to get the British out. Just whatever it would be, that was it. And so Mountbatten then developed this partition plan, basically based on majority and minority areas. So in the spring of 1947, they came up with this partition plan with the two wings of Pakistan totally separated, and they pushed this through largely by closing their eyes to the problems of the violence that this was likely to bring, because there was huge amount of correspondence coming from the provinces, particularly Punjab, saying, if you do this, there is going to be a terrible outbreak of violence. And Mountbatten's view is this is all exaggerated. They set up a boundary force, but it wasn't enough. But anyway, what happened was this all led up to, we're back to our meeting in June 1947, when Mountbatten sat at the table and got both Nehru and Jinnah to agree to this plan. No, neither of them really liked it, because the Pakistan that was created, Jinnah called a moth-eaten Pakistan because it was smaller than he wanted. Nehru didn't want India to be divided, but they both agreed. And interestingly for Nehru was worried that if there were no solution and there was a kind of civil war, the real danger to India was not from the Muslims, but that India would fragment and its provinces would all go their own ways. And so he saw partition, one slice, one division, as better than an uncertain situation for a long time. So then, Radcliffe came and drew the lines, and the thing about this, Radcliffe's lines actually were not announced by the actual date of partition. So at the very time India got independence in Pakistan, no one knew where the boundaries were actually going to be, which is part of the general uncertainty and problems in organization. But anyway, a few days later, they were announced. And then this tremendous violence broke out. But I want to just give one quotation here to suggest the real contradictions in all of this. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah appeared on the cover of Life magazine in early 1948. He was this great father of Pakistan. And he gave this speech, which is widely quoted because it's a speech suggesting in Pakistan that even if it was founded as a Muslim state, there should be toleration, that other religions should be tolerated. So it's a speech that is often referred back to by liberals in Pakistan who would like a more secular state, even if it's defined by Islam. So there's much to admire in this quote, but what's most interesting about it is if you think back to the two-nation theory, to the idea that Muslims are a separate nation, you remember, because of all those cultural characteristics. Jinnah, at the very moment Pakistan was created, in this quote, basically repudiates the two-nation theory. He says, once the boundaries are drawn, whether you're a Muslim or a Hindu doesn't matter, you're a citizen of the state, you should be loyal to your own state, minorities should be protected, which we could all admire. But the fact is, it's a repudiation of the justification for Pakistan at the very moment it was created. And this is a kind of, indication of all of the complexity and conflict surrounding this, and which there's this book called The Long Partition, which came out a few years ago. It's actually an excellent book. But the point of it is that partition didn't just happen in 1947. It is ongoing. And I could go through many examples of how it continues to influence things, but just one. You look at the situation of Muslims as a minority in India today, and they are widely discriminated against, and it's a very difficult situation. And one could say, and it's a huge number, the number of Muslims in India today is something like, I'm not sure the exact figure, but 150, 160 million. So it's a big minority. It's comparable to the percentage in the population of African Americans in the United States, to just give you a sense of it. And the many people just see Muslims as second-class citizens, or not truly citizens of at all. And all this goes back to the two-nation theory, that they're suspect. And so this is one just of many legacies of partition which we could talk about. But let me stop there, because I haven't left much time, but maybe a few minutes for some questions. Or we're near the end. So that's good. Yeah, just one.
Talk a little bit about Gandhi's engagement, what he wanted and what he said, and with whom he had major relationships in India.
Well, Gandhi, I mean, relating to partition. So, I mean, Gandhi was deeply opposed to partition, and he made this famous comment about, you know, partition my body before you partition India. But the fact is, during all these complex negotiations, at the end, Gandhi basically checked out. You know, he was no longer really involved in government discussions about this. And he did play a very active role, particularly in Bengal, in trying to call for nonviolence and condemning the violence. And this did have some significant impact. It's interesting, of course, after partition, Gandhi was worked quite hard against anti-Muslim discrimination, and in fact, Gandhi was assassinated in January 1948 precisely because he had spoken up for agreements that had been made with Pakistan. There had been an agreement to divide assets after partition, and India was supposed to pay a certain amount of money to Pakistan, and the government refused to do it because they were, you know, fighting with Pakistan in Kashmir, and they said, you can't give money to your enemies. And Gandhi said, no, 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 this was a moral commitment. You must give this money. And he was assassinated by a right-wing Hindu. So Gandhi's role is very interesting and important, and his kinds of commitments were important. But yet, he didn't play all that central a role in this final period that led to partition. So, thank you all for coming.